Hello everyone and welcome back to A Worst to Best. It's been once again a long time since I've done one of these, but this is a special one since I'm going to talk about Whitehouse, the pioneers and the creators of power electronics, and definitely one of the most essential and most influential long-running projects of industrial and noise music to emerge from back in the 80s with ideas and approaches that would sound way too extreme and really ahead of their time, and a project going for around 3 decades, having multiple albums under their belt until the end of the project back in 2009. Whitehouse was a project mainly run by William Bennett, and throughout the history of this whole project there have been multiple other members having a crucial role in some of the albums, with examples being artists like Philip Best, Peter Sotos, and Kevin Tompkins, to name a few. In this long-running project, William Bennett and all of the other artists would just go into multiple different phases of noise and power electronics music, and alongside all of that they would just have some of the most extreme themes presented in albums, touching upon subjects like serial killers, sex offenders, and later multiple paraphilias including pedophilia. With that being said, I feel that the extreme nature in both the lyrics and the music manages to be quite effective with the majority of the albums they've done, and they've actually done a lot of stuff. Whitehouse for me is an amazing project, which is impressive that having such a long discography, I don't find that there is a miss in any of their projects. Now, to be fair, I don't feel that every single album works the same. There have been occasions where Whitehouse would make lots of different projects at the same time, and that results in some of those albums feeling somewhat identical to their sound and not managing to be that much effective. But I still don't find there is a project that I would dislike. At their worst, they're just decent. And with that being said, starting at number 20, we have the album Buchenwald, which I find to be the worst Whitehouse project. It definitely has some interesting ideas, it is disturbing, it has its moments, but basically if you have heard other albums that have come out in this era, even if it's another album that sounds ahead of its time, it's not as effective and as groundbreaking compared to other stuff they've done at the same time. I find this to be possibly the least engaging Whitehouse project, with really long, repetitive passages, sometimes become way too minimal and it doesn't work that much in its favor, and the lack of really extreme soundscapes or vocals, resulting to an overall experience that might feel kind of bland. It's still a good project though. It's not a bad album, but it definitely had potential for something more, considering that is also a really short project. On the other hand, at number 19, we have Psychopathia Sexualis, which is possibly the longest Whitehouse album, going for about 51 minutes. And I find that this album conceptually is actually one of the most interesting albums from Whitehouse, but in its execution, it is without a doubt one of the most underwhelming moments. This album ends up being a mess of so many different sounds, and it's at this point where I feel that after a series of many intriguing albums, in Psychopathia Sexualis it felt like they basically ran out of ideas. It's separated in multiple phases, which at the end they just end up becoming a bit of a mess. We have the first side, which basically is a list of some of the most infamous serial killers and sex offenders to ever exist. The thing is that the tracks would start with the same introductions that would basically be narrations in Spanish, and then you have some very bland and forgettable sounds of power electronics to them in some really short tracks. Then the second side of this album would have a track that has recordings of rocket missiles, and then you have a live track that goes for 20 minutes. And as far as it's a nice track, it feels so disconnected compared to anything else in this album. And so yeah, like I said, it becomes a bit of a mess. There are still some very good moments, but the more I listen to it, the more I end up feeling that this is definitely one of the most underwhelming moments in the Whitehouse catalog. We have another album about serial killers. This is Right to Kill, dedicated to Dennis Nelson. It has its moments, it has some nice ideas, it's a short album, straight to the point. I find that there are some really extreme sounds, but overall it's a bit one-dimensional, kind of identical with some other projects they've done, and this one in particular doesn't have something that much more engaging or different to it. New Britain is more of the same. They would definitely have some doozies when it comes to like the first era of Whitehouse, as I feel that it would serve more as an experimentation phase, even if it would still sound really ahead of its time. Now the thing with New Britain is that I find that there are some moments that are really poorly executed, extremely repetitive and one-dimensional, and others that would feel really good. For example, the tracks New Britain and Ravensback, they're amazing tracks. The thing I don't really get with this album is why it has so long silent passages anytime a track ends. Like it would have 20 seconds of just complete silence anytime a track ends, and I don't really get why. But overall, I found that there are some nice moments, but others that are a bit repetitive. It's a bit of a mess of an album consisting significant highlights and lowlights, but yeah, other than that, it's a decent project. Erector, one of the first and one of the most intense albums in this era. It's definitely quite intense, and it's one of the first occasions where you'd see some of those very ear-piercing and torturous high frequencies, which is one of the signature sounds that you would find in Whitehouse. And I feel that in moments like with Erector, they're presented amazingly. However, those 4 tracks, they're a bit longer than needed. Quite minimal, they easily become one-dimensional, and there is not something that much to it, especially with the last 2 tracks. It definitely has its moments, it's definitely disturbing. However, for me, there are albums that would come out in the same era that would have more of an energy and more of an intensity to them, with more compelling ideas from start to finish, and this is why Erector ends up being closer to my worst list. Birth Death Experience, the very first album from Whitehouse, coming back in 1980. An album that would definitely sound so ahead of its time. It was something really unique, something that would end up becoming a really signature sound in the underground as we speak. As a debut though, I don't find Birth Death Experience aging that well. Lo-fi, slightly amateurish, quite repetitive, and outside the great Mind Phaser and the intriguing The Second Coming, the rest of the album is basically just okay, and then you have the self-titled one, Birth Death Experience, that it's just silence for 3 minutes, and I don't really get why. It's an important debut, but is it one of the best Whitehouse albums? No, I don't think so. Halogen, the first album that I have from the next era of Whitehouse in the 90s. Now, even if I find this the worst album out of this era, it's still a pretty decent project. Now, granted, there are definitely moments that are a bit repetitive, and compared to some other moments that would just have a big emphasis on low frequencies and some great bass response, this album in particular might feel really empty and not that engaging. I find that there are great moments like Lightning Struck My Dick, but other than that, yeah, the rest of the album is basically okay. It's still good enough in order to have this on vinyl, and I don't regret it. I find it to be a really decent project. Next is Twice Is Not Enough, one of the 2 albums they did in 1992, And I find that this album is okay. It definitely has some very good moments in terms of sound. I find that the combination of both high and low frequencies works in a very fascinating way, but it's still something that we've heard with like the previous work, Thank Your Lucky Stars, and this one in particular doesn't enhance in something that much more fulfilling. Instead, some of the moments are pretty one-dimensional, slightly repetitive, but I still find that the intensity of this album definitely has quite a lot to be desired. Total Sex, the second album they did in 1980. Really disturbing, and unlike Birth Death Experience, I find that the ideas over here would enhance even better the signature sound of power electronics as we know it. Brutal soundscapes with tracks like Face Day and Ultra Sadism stealing the show. A really short album, straight to the point, disturbing from start to finish. That's all you need to know. Racket is the final installment from Whitehouse in 2007. The final album is definitely one of the most unique ones they've done, even if it has identical elements that you would find in some of the previous albums in this era like Cruise, Birdseed or Ascetist 2006. Racket definitely has a much more high emphasis on tribal percussion, which is something that we see becoming finally the case with the next project of William Bennett being Cut Hands. Racket is basically the album where we see this transition happening to Cut Hands, and in my opinion it makes for definitely one of the most unique and one of the most intriguing albums from Whitehouse, but overall the ideas that are presented, even if they would be really loud and really intense, they would end up becoming a bit meh in some occasions. I find that the first tracks are okay, but as the album progresses, even if it's a short project, it ends up becoming quickly one-dimensional, quickly repetitive, and I find that the final tracks end up becoming a bit bland, but overall really good project, and definitely one that I feel that those who grew up with Whitehouse in like the 80s would not expect this after all of those years to be the final output of Whitehouse. And now we get into the top 10 with the first entry being Never Forget Death. The second album they did in 1992, it's another really short, straightforward project that also has some of the best ideas they would make in this sound, especially with the self-titled one being an absolute monster of a song. Now, for some reason, there's the first time in all of those years where we see a warning sign on the track Torture Chamber saying basically that this shouldn't be played in high volume, which I don't know why this is the case. I'm pretty sure that Whitehouse had many more extreme and louder occasions with previous projects, and there was no warning sign over there. It still, I get it, it has some high frequencies. It can be quite annoying to viewers who cannot easily digest sounds like this, but this is basically the case with pretty much every single Whitehouse project. Other than that, really compelling, solid, extreme stuff. Definite recommendation for sure. Number 9 is Ascetist's 2006. An album that would definitely land higher on this list if it wasn't as identical as it is with Birdseed. 3 years after their most significant work to ever come out, Ascetist really doesn't provide something that much different. Like the very first track, Dance for example, sounds so much like another version of Rig Like a Fucking Nail. Other than that though, this 28-minute album is insane. It is absolutely ferocious. It definitely has some of the most well-delivered vocal passages and screams from both Philip Best and William Bennett. It's loud, it's disgusting, it's in your face. The frequencies heard, it is extremely filthy and aggressive, and it makes for one of the biggest highlights in the entire Whitehouse catalog. Number 8, Great White Death. Well, this is where we get to the really good stuff. This album is great. It is the final installment they would have in their first phase of albums, which would make it sound like one of their most mature and one of their most well-developed projects, and it definitely delivers. In only 27 minutes, we get some of the most intense and some of the most disturbing material we've seen from Whitehouse in this era, with tracks like You Don't Have to Say Please, Rape Master, and I'm Coming Up Your Ass being some really apparent highlights, and I feel that the titles speak by themselves. If they're not enough to show you the extreme and disturbing nature of this album, then don't worry, the torturous sounds themselves would definitely convince you. Number 7, Thank Your Lucky Stars, the very next project 5 years later, after the first time the project ended and William Bennett just started making music once again, with Thank Your Lucky Stars definitely showing a different direction, making for one of the most intriguing and one of the most exceptional albums to be ever made in the whole Whitehouse catalog. This is the very first time where we see this extremely tight combination of both low and high frequencies. The high frequencies over here would not have the same exaggerating amount of feedback that you would expect in some of like the 80s stuff. However, the sounds are once again really filthy, really disturbing, and I find that William Bennett's approach in the vocals makes for some of the most notorious ones we've heard from a Whitehouse project. It's definitely a big highlight in their catalog, and it has so many good moments to it. And now, at number 6, this is where we get to the really messed up stuff with Mommy and Daddy back in 1998. This is the very first occasion where we see Whitehouse shifting to their most intense and their most chaotic direction yet, which would follow up with some of their final signature moments. Mommy and Daddy is an absolutely intense project from start to finish. In 5 tracks and 45 minutes of material, there's not a single moment where this album is going to leave you breathe fresh air. It would constantly suffocate you. Tracks like Philosophy of the Wife Beater and I Can't Like You are without a doubt some of the most disturbing and some of the most intense tracks they've ever done, with some torturous frequencies. And if that wasn't enough, we have the track Dado, which starts as a really haunting ambient piece but ends up having some really loud frequencies, some really distorted passages, and also elements of glitch. And it's insane. And if that wasn't enough, we have the track Private, where it's the first time we see an infamous sound collage of Peter Sotos, which, if you are unaware of those sound collages, they basically have recordings of victims of child rape, child abuse, and many other traumatizing material that would end up making you insane. Number 5, Cruise, the significant 2001 album. Now, this is before Birdseed 2 years later, and actually elements of Birdseed have been in Cruise before. This is basically where it started. This is where we got one of the filthiest and one of the most intense Whitehouse projects. We once again have a 3-minute track, Princess Disease, that it's just complete silence, and I don't really get why. But then you have filthy, disgusting tracks like Cruise, Movement 2000, another long Peter Sotos sound collage called Public, the ear-piercing, mind-numbingly insane and torturous Scapegoat, the absolute horrifying 7-minute dance The Desperate Breath, which is like rated R ASMR. And we also have the track I Can't Like You once again, which I'm not complaining, but I don't really see the point why. If it wasn't really for moments like Princess Disease and I Can't Like You being played once again, I feel that this album would be placed even higher, but for what it is, it's an essential Whitehouse project and one of the essentials of power electronics in general. It is such a good album of just really disturbing stuff from start to finish. At number 4 is Quality Time, one of my favorites, and I find that it's possibly one of the most underrated ones. This album in particular, I feel that it has some of the most disturbing moments from like every Whitehouse project to ever come out. There is not really that much of an intensity to it compared to other projects. It's possibly one of the most chill albums, I would say, but what it presents with some of the sounds is beyond disturbing. Like, you have Quality Time where you have some vocal deliveries that would sound more disturbing and more filthy than ever before. And you also have the extremely disgusting Baby. Like, it feels that you legit hear some baby sounds, some really concerning ones, and also like the sound of water. It is a really disgusting moment that I don't know how to explain. We also have the amazing Just Like I Can't, one of the most significant tracks in the whole Whitehouse catalog. Other than that, the album might not be one of the most intense, but it's definitely one of the most effective ones in terms of just being really disturbing, in your face, and just making a great job of making you feel uneasy. Getting to the final top 3, I decided to include the collab project of William Bennett and Nurse with Wound under the name 150 Murderous Passions and all of the rest, because it's a long title. Now, this is a 1981 project that sounds so much ahead of its time. It's actually insane, the sound of this thing, just how brutal and just how torturous it sounds. Like, if there's an album that I would say sounds like torture music, the first album that would come to my mind is this one. This is mind-numbingly insane from start to finish. Like, it has 2 tracks. Now, the first one is a bit more bizarre to the sense that it feels more that it has some of the signature sounds of Nurse with Wound, but it's still so bizarre because it has some of those very distorted bells that would just play constantly with like echoing and also playing in reverse after a while, and some very distant and disorienting vocals from William Bennett. And then you have the second track, which is just non-stop, ear-piercing high frequencies. This track is torture and music, and not only that, I feel that it sounds amazing and really ahead of its time and just really exceptional. For all of those reasons, I don't know why in particular, but I find that those 2 tracks in this really short album just emit so many different emotions of just disgust. And this is a collab that I would never expect it was bound to happen. But it's here, and I'm glad that it exists because it makes for one of the greatest albums I've ever heard, especially in terms of like really bizarre noise and power electronics. Getting into number 2, we have Dedicated to Peter Kurten, Sadist, and Mass Slayer. Throughout all of the serial killers that have been put out in multiple albums from Whitehouse, especially in this period of time, I would remember reading the story of Peter Kurten and just being really frightened by all of the despicable things he has done and just how sickening his mind would be. And that's before me ever knowing the existence of Whitehouse or even like noise and power electronics. And then I heard this album and it pretty much takes all of the elements that would make for such disorienting, disturbing, and pretty intense albums back in the day and would just put it in their best album in this era. Without a doubt, I find that out of everything they've done in the early 80s, Dedicated to Peter Kurten is by far the most disgusting, the most disturbing one, and the one that sounds mostly ahead of its time. I still cannot believe that this is an album that was made back in 1981. It's weird how they would get away with something like this, or how people would perceive an album like this back in the day, back when it was officially released. In just 24 minutes, making it possibly the shortest album from Whitehouse, we get just non-stop torture sounds. Possibly some of the loudest and some of the most furious and just disgusting set of high frequencies from like any album from back in the day. A set of tracks that would have these constant sounds of splashing water and vocals that would just sound so insane, and with a context that it's even more disturbing. The album might end up having some weaker moments towards the second half, with some moments that would be more instrumental and end up becoming a bit more repetitive to their sound. If that was not the case and we had more moments like with the first leg of this album, this would easily be landing on my number one spot, but for what it is, I can't really complain. It is definitely one of the most disturbing albums I've ever heard. The display of just the extreme nature of the serial killer gives me the impression that when I'm listening to this album, I'm basically in the mindset of this serial killer. And if that's the case, then it sounds really chaotic and really traumatizing in a sense. And finally, yeah, at number one, I know it's too obvious. You might say it's a pleb choice, but I can't help thinking that this is not only the best Whitehouse project by far from start to finish, but it's also possibly the greatest album and the most essential one of power electronics. And that's obviously Birdseed. I can't believe that I have this on vinyl. The magnum opus of Whitehouse, their greatest work from everything they've done, from start to finish. This album does not leave you a single breath of fresh air, even if they would have multiple disturbing and disgusting moments in their whole catalog. No other album manages to be as effective on being disturbing and on being misanthropic and just filthy in every single regard as Birdseed. Also, this album has possibly the greatest first 3-track run I've heard in any album. You have Why You Never Became a Dancer, which instantly blasted your speakers, and it has some great narration and screams and sounds that are going to make you feel uneasy. And the concept by itself, the narrative and the story, it's just disgusting from start to finish. Then you have Wriggle Like a Fucking Eel, one of the most essential power electronics tracks to ever come out. It is mind-numbingly intense. This track drives me insane. It's one of the few occasions where I listen to a song and not only do I get chills in my entire body, but this track makes me wanna punch and break everything that is in front of me. I just listen to this song and I just get so furious, so angry. Few other tracks manage to be this effective in making me so angry. Like, Rig Like a Fucking Eel is such an aggressive track. It's torturous, but it feels so satisfying in a very weird way. Then after that, we have an amazing transition with Philosophy, which unlike the previous two songs contains some very haunting, dark spoken word vocals with no intensity to them. However, this track becomes a 9-minute nightmare. It's so frightening. The scenes that are accompanied in some occasions, they make for a very disturbing song, accompanied with a non-stop high frequency that pierces your ears for 9 minutes straight. And then we have the self-titled one, Birdseed, which is basically another one of those Peter Soto's collage tracks. But let me tell you something. I find that Birdseed, right there, is possibly the most messed up collage of recordings I've heard from a Peter Soto's track. I thought that Buyer's Market was messed up, which, don't get me wrong, it is. It is really messed up. But I find that Peter Soto's saved the most disturbing and the worst ones for Birdseed. This track, with those recordings it has, it just fills me with so much anger and misanthropy. It makes me angry, it makes me upset, other times it makes me wanna cry. This is so hard to sit through. Like, I haven't experienced something this traumatizing as it's depicted with such great and disturbing amounts of detail in this particular track. However, just by listening to it, I'm traumatized. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. I have no words for what is depicted in some of the material in this track in particular. Now, I know what you're going to say. You might say that this is unnecessarily edgy, that this just sounds bad. And truth be honest, this album has extreme shock value to it, and it would constantly push your head closer and closer to what's disturbing about it. It would constantly make you want to see the problem. It would not stop, not even for a single moment, to shock you. From start to finish, this album has the purpose to shock you. However, I don't find that this filthy depiction is just achieved lyrically, but also musically. I find that this album, in what it does, it's one of the most effective ones I've heard. It's also one of the most varied power electronics albums to ever come out. It might revolve around the same shock nature, but each single track is a different mood, and it's a different approach on the genre. And whether it's just furious, torturous, mind-numbingly insane, whether it's just extended minimalism, or whether it's just pure shock value, I think that in every single occasion it works, and in every single occasion it is effective. And for all of those reasons, I find Birdseed not only being the greatest Whitehouse project, but also one of the greatest albums of all time. If you're looking for an album that is going to crush your soul, look no further than this one. And this is where I'm going to leave it. This is my list for Whitehouse, worst to best. Have you heard all of the albums of Whitehouse? And if so, how would you rank them? I would like to see your own opinions down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.